All right, and hopefully this is a return to what would be one of many visual podcasts that I will do. I did a few before. I remember when my friend Cindy came on the program, Impossible Princess, and we were talking about a lot of early American design and her essays on things like mid-century design and the Y2K aesthetic and so on and so forth, early internet art. But before we proceed, please like, share, subscribe, click the bell. Really helps me out in the algorithm, all that good stuff. And yeah, and also I have a QR code to my Patreon, but I pretty much will have to add a QR code for my painting website, or maybe I'll just switch it. But the paywalled version, I wanted to talk about something different but related in terms of different artists that I am mapping out here. There was recently a very vicious and unwarranted, in my opinion, attack on the group of seven by the CBC Arts channel on YouTube. And so I figure I wanted to give you more of an art lesson here, or rather an art history lesson, between various artists that are both inspired by, not both, but are together inspired by the landscape that was around them, but also inspired by various trends in abstract expressionism that were going around, particularly in North America, and how that these painters, the three of them that I've chosen, or rather, well, four of them, how they have a relevance to the work of art today, and why this artwork is not just important, but I think can present you a different view of what abstract expressionism really is in terms of a spiritual connection to the landscape that naturally leads the artist towards what you could term abstraction. But as we will see, particularly with Debencorn, this term abstraction has become a term of sort of a very slippery term in some sense, an abusive term, something that's sardonic. But I think that you really can appreciate the different work that these painters were doing. So, to begin, I want to read an essay and show you the works in this essay that I found on the American abstract and landscape painter Richard Debencorn. And then I wanted to show you some Canadian examples, both historically and also contemporary. Although all contemporary is kind of a weird word, but and then finally I wanted to show you an essay by one of my favorite art critics of all time, Robert Hughes, commenting in the 70s, I believe. When was this from? No, yeah, 1977, on the works of one of my favorite Italian American painters, Giorgio Cavallon, in keeping with his own tradition in the art world and various influences that he had from both Europe and also being a leader in the abstract expressionist movement around New York and so on and so forth at the time, but sort of a relatively unknown compared to the greats, even though he showed with a lot of them. I believe he showed with de Kooning and Franz Klein. So the title of this is called The Painters of Light, and how their unique approach to light in the work of art from the early to the mid century of the previous century and even into the 21st century. I wanted to show you the connection between these various artists and their importance. And then I will, in the full version of this podcast, the paid version, I will dive into this vicious attack with some bread tube adjacent art critic on YouTube that our tax money has gone towards in this collaboration with the CBC Arts here in Canada. I wanted to give a critique in defense of the group of seven. And so we'll see how that goes. Uh, I'll have to, I'll have to sort of sidestep a lot of my deeply felt and very instinctual defense of the group of seven. We'll get to that, but here we have to begin with an essay on the works of Richard Debencorn, one of the great after the Hudson River School, truly one of the great American landscape painters that influenced a whole generation of painters that came after in the 70s and 80s and 90s. So here we go. All right, well, that's Giorgio Cavallon, but we'll get to that. So this comes from idealart.com, and this gives you quick biographical information. Died in 1983, left behind a body of work that defended the importance of painting, and he also was, I believe, a professor or a teacher of painting. Despite rubbing elbows with some of the most influential artists of his generation, he remained staunchly individualistic, creating an oeuvre that stands today as unique and instantly recognizable. After beginning his career as an abstract painter in the 1940s, one that incidentally believed no worthwhile modern painter should bother with figurative work, Debencorn suddenly shifted his focus on portraiture, still life, and landscape painting. So when abstract expressionism became very trendy in the 40s and 50s, he was still inspired by the landscape and he still pursued that within his work, but then he would have these different periods, sort of like a Canadian artist that I'm going to talk about, Takeo Tanabe, where they have works where certain periods they'll go back to abstraction, then they'll go back to the landscape. And one of my favorite things that Takeo Tanabe said was that, I believe he's 99 years old this year. He's still alive. But he was at New York. He as a Japanese Canadian. He was at New York along with a lot of these other artists at the time, and he was doing a lot of abstract and hard edge paintings when it was very trendy and popular in the 60s because geographic minimalism and hard edge became the thing after abstract expressionism. And he said that I always wanted to return to abstraction. After many, many years, he did this in a recording for a Canadian art program called Landscape as Muse, which I believe the episode was from 2013 or 2014, something like that. So after many years, many decades, he said, I always wanted to return to abstraction, but I look at a particular landscape around Vancouver Island, a particular seascape, and I'm pulled right back into it. And so I always admire that sentiment, because I too always had this idea of returning to abstraction in my own work, but just never sort of getting there because with the landscape, there's always infinite possibilities and infinite perfectibility of more. There's always more to come. There's always, even within the same basic location, especially doing a plein air painting, there's always something that you see that's different at the time of different times of day, different times of the season. And there's always an ability to go into either venturing into total abstraction or doing something that is faithful to a similitude of the real. And there are certain painters, traditionally, I would say Ivan Shishkin would be one of them in Russia, where they have very well done landscapes that are very heavily labored over in the studio. But then they have those plein air studies that have a breath and a life to them and that have a vibe, if you will, to use modern contemporary language, that you don't find in the studio works because a lot of them have the allusions to realism, like his snowscapes, his trees in the snow. There's that one Ivan Shishkin painting where it's very faithful to the landscape in a forest after it snowed directly, and it's like, wow, almost I'm looking at a photograph. And then you have his sketches and his studies, his plein air studies that are totally different, that are almost minimalistic in a lot of ways. So since it defies conviction and those of almost every other painter of note, but then a decade later he transitioned back towards abstraction. In the midst of being told he was revolutionary, he said, and this is an important point, I'm really a traditional painter, not avant-garde at all, adding that he really wanted to do what was follow a tradition and extend it, like the Group of Seven, like, generation before him in Canada. To his way of thinking, the apparently different directions he took were part of a single path, a gradual evolution away from ideological confusion and towards an understanding of the ancient and everlasting problems involved in simply making good paintings. So Richard Debencorn, to quote my frenemy Paul Talk, he wanted to aim towards true painting. And you have to realize when he was painting these works, which I'll get into when I discuss this attack on the Group of Seven by the CBC, when there were so many social, political, and cultural upheavals within American life at the time of his really the stride that he took within his work, it's not that he was ignorant of all of that. It's just that he chose to take what he felt was the ultimate importance of painting and of the work of art in painting and extend it further gradually. And I think that there's something noble in that because the totalizing demand of ideology upon the work of art is something that is very brittle, but something that is very supple that gives way to what is naturally felt within the work of art. That is the ultimate meaning. And there is, in a sense, this invigoration of activist art. There is this need to project one's ideals out into the world, and there is a social demand that is very much, how shall I say it? I mean, the immediate term that comes to mind is sort of like a Maoist struggle session, but yeah, in the '60s, it definitely was that, and the 2010s. If you read Dean Kissick's article that we covered on Digital Archipelago, me and my co-host Prudentialist, a while ago, probably I think, well, last year, early last year, we covered this amazing essay in Harper's Magazine by Dean Kissick about the art, the work of art in the 2010s, and the demand to subsume the work of art as merely a editorialization, a dramatization of social conditions. But of course, only social conditions that these institutions allow. I mean, in terms of the narrative, the ideological narrative. And if an artist were to attempt to create agitprop in a different direction, well, then that's part of the problem. But if an artist also ignores that and chooses to develop the tradition of the work of art, that's also wrong. So it's almost a very juvenile impulse, put it that way. And to sort of the how shall I say it? The expression of the no, the expression of the negative, the expression of I would rather not is a very powerful sentiment. And to just do what your soul demands of you within your own work of art. That is a very powerful sentiment that should not be ignored because a lot of times we don't remember those at what seemed at the time great political works of art. Some of them we do. Some of them we only remember because of the machinations of media propaganda that foist them into our lives constantly. But those works after time are often ridiculed and often lambasted. Do you like? I know here's a pretty vulgar example, and I know I'm getting way ahead of myself. I really should save this for this CBC attack on the Group of Seven. When you think of a Banksy painting, or if you think of all those paintings that those European artists did during the beginnings of the migrant crisis, the boy washing on the shore, you know the one, right? Is it that most maybe most normal people they'll look at that for a moment and they'll say, but when you look specifically at an activist work of art that is really a form of political catch, like Banksy, do you look at that with any fondness? Or do you look at that as just another potential to remix into a meme, to ridicule it? because a lot of online meme culture that is inherently political doesn't have a pretense to being a lasting work of art of any stretch. Some memes we will remember for generations, some meme templates we'll remember forever. But in terms of their value as a political statement within the work of art, uh, the meaning becomes very obscured and very sporadic over time. Now, don't get me wrong, there's some great works of propaganda that will be remembered for generations in painting, in film, in visual art, in music, but that's very few and far between. Now, there's this one painting I could remember by Daumier that was the sort of era template of, I think he called it the People's Protest or something like that. And it wasn't specifically about the French Revolution. It was merely an aestheticization of the act of protest. Those are works that people will remember forever. But Banksy, not so much. So a lot of the 2010s art, I mean, can you name any? Maybe like a liberal Jane poster, again, to ridicule. But a lot of the artworks in the 2010s, apart from like very vulgar examples, I don't really I don't see like a lot of them surviving into the next few decades in terms of relevance. But anyways, a traditional rebel. Richard Debencorn is known today as quintessential California painter. His loose yet balanced compositions and washed out color palette help define the aesthetic of a culture of freedom, breeziness, and amazing light. But Debencorn was born in Portland, Oregon. He moved to California at age 2. Before becoming a professional painter, he served for 2 years as a U.S. Marine during World War II. He used his GI Bill privileges to attend art school. Then he threw himself wholeheartedly into abstract expressionism. Dominant trend at the time, he was in good company, studying, teaching alongside emerging California painters like Mark Rothko and Clifford Still. Clifford Still truly is another great artist in that school. I like a lot of his jagged line work. I quite enjoy a lot of the color swatching and matching, very reminiscent of Cezanne, for example. Debencorn soon started moving around, studying and teaching in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which actually that connects him to Lauren Harris and Georgia O'Keeffe. You know, there was always a lot of artists that went to New Mexico as a sort of like refuge from California or New York. So, then he returned to California and San Francisco. His travels, he became aware of a long conversation occurring between painters of many different mindsets, one that had less to do with what he began to see as the false separation between abstraction and figuration, and more to do with the deeper relevance of what a painting can accomplish. He arrived at the conclusion that all paintings start out as a mood, out of a relation with things or people, out of a complete visual impression. To call this expression abstract seems to me often to confuse the issue. And here we have a great work, Berkeley 3, Berkeley, California. And here you can see a lot of the influences of Kandinsky's earlier work and Paul Klee, because Richard Ebencorn, he had this amazing ability to create these minimalistic impressions that had a lot of power and energy. And he really didn't need to I mean, they are very painterly gestural strokes, but he often used, like, I think he used a lot of turpentine and he had a lot of very thin color washes that still retain brush marks, but you don't get the same sense of like the thick paint of certain other traditions within abstraction, but also within landscape painting. Like he's not really, as you can see these other works. I mean, these are some of his famous still lifes and landscape paintings, and we'll get to that. World of Color and Plains. So yeah, the traditional rebel. So there you go. He's keeping within the tradition, but he's expanding it in such a way that he is finding different things in them. And he's really collapsing the orthodoxy between abstraction and figuration, or abstraction and representational painting. And in a way, he's going back to the foundation of abstraction itself, which is within the natural world. And he's going back to that tradition that a lot of painters after him, such as such as John Virtue in the UK, a lot of painters would then take inspiration from, and really stripping down the landscape to its bare bones, to where it's verging on abstraction. But he's really not trying to be conscious of, I am abstracting the landscape as such. He is merely taking to the logical conclusion that impressionist maxim of painting what you see. And what he's seeing is, again, to quote de Kooning, he's slipping into the visual plane. And he's coming out with these very verging on minimalist, but not really. They have a lot of light and tone. They're not flat, as you can see in the still life. There's a lot of light and shade and tone. Of course, he's being influenced by Cezanne and by other ones. But at the same time, they're very immediate impressions. He's not doing a lot of gussying them up. There's a lot of visual and ragged brush marks, and he is taking what you often see in plein air painting as well, which is because of the time constraints and the constraints of the light and the shade. He is really trying to get down an immediate impression of the scene, and he's not really worried too much about color blending. He's really matching color, and even just certain little things here and there, like that, like the shrubs near the house, breaking up the centerpiece of the landscape and breaking up what would just be seen as a huge block of color in this very pale pastel blue in those houses you see in California. By that little bit of green, that little bit of orange, he's breaking up the color plane and he's arranging it into an element of shapes and patterns. Same with the still life here. So the changing attitude Deboncourt adopted towards abstraction put him in a strange position for a modernist. Since the late 1900s, most abstract artists had originally trained as realistic figurative artists, then transitioned to abstraction through a process of reduction towards a simpler vision of language. Deboncourt began with abstraction and then transitioned into figuration. Well, I also did the same. I think that's why I'm so attracted to his work. But now, freed from the illusion of the philosophic difference between abstraction and figuration, he found that he was able to paint what he saw: human figures, faces, and urban natural landscapes, while still exploring within these images the qualities and elements of abstraction he found most interesting. Rather than mimicking real life with hyperrealistic painting, Deboncourt translated the visible world into arrangements of color fields, lines, and quasi-geometric shapes. He worked with a charcoal and oil paint, allowing multiple layers to show through the final composition. And then Cityscape 1 is one of the most famous early figure paintings: geometric shapes, linear planes, and abstract color fields, underlayers, and tortured marks of compositional perfectionism combined into a figurative vision that is simultaneously expressionistic and somehow abstract. And of course, his Albuquerque series. And I believe he was looking at a lot of aerial visuals of different parts of Albuquerque and California. And here is those the very long, narrow, and steep roadways in California, in San Francisco in particular. And here you can see a very fully developed landscape, but still using a lot of jagged brushstrokes. There's this one painter in California on YouTube. This reminds me of. I believe I heard of Richard Deboncourt from him. If you look up California plein air, if you look up what's his name, is it Charles Buckland or something like that on YouTube? If you just search on plein air California on YouTube, you'll find him. But he does a lot of these street scenes as well in San Francisco. And I believe that's where I heard of Charles Deboncourt. It was either, sorry, Richard Deboncourt. I believe it was either from him or it was from the other landscape YouTuber Brad Tier, who mentioned Richard Deboncourt. And that's how I heard of him. Around 1966, after a decade or so of figurative painting, Deboncourt began a new series that art historians heralded the return of the artist to pure abstraction. He named the series Ocean Park, after the beachfront in Santa Monica neighborhood where his painting studio was located, north of Los Angeles. Indeed, the Ocean Park paintings seemed to lack any obvious references to figurative elements. They appeared geometric and abstract, but simply call these paintings geometric abstraction and label them as another departure from his previous work is a simplistic reading. In an interview he gave to CBS Sunday Morning in 1988, he mentioned the impact his environment always had on his work. And again, another thing I can share with him. He elaborates that a sense of place more than anything else informed his mature paintings. The Ocean Park paintings are not a return to something any more than a figurative paintings of the earlier decade were a departure from something. They're all one thing. It's all one thing. It's all an expression of what is around him. It is in keeping with a sense of localization that informs the artist directly and sensuously, that no grander illusion towards some greater cultural or ideological pastiche could ever replicate. So that's the whole point. In both periods, Debencorn explored the issue of composition, harmony, color, and balance. The Ocean Park series does the same using light, shapes, and aesthetic arrangements of space. Debencorn encounters in the real world. Sorry, encountered. He's, unfortunately has long since passed. In this case, the world of Santa Monica beachfront to inform a further investigation of the same issue. When did Richard Debencorn pass? Let's see here. Richard Debencorn. When did he died? March 30th, 1993. I was born December 21st, December 23rd, 1992. Am I the No, I'm not gonna do that. I'm not gonna do that meme. Welcome back, Richard Debencorn. Happy, but yeah, so that's one of the paintings from his Ocean Park series. You can almost see the aerial aspect of it. You can almost see a lot of really the evolution of his work within these color washes. It reminds me very heavily of Helen Frankenthaler. And I believe that they were he still used oil, but then by this time in the 70s, Helen Frankenthaler, around the 80s and 90s, she transitioned to acrylic painting. But you can see that there is almost like those Paul Klee works when he went to Tunisia. You can see a lot of those very like pastel warm colors and those color blocks, almost like marker in a way. And you could see the color washes together, but they're very like almost bordering on hard edge. But you can see they're just veils of color that are draped across the canvas. And they have this sort of sensuousness to them, very similar to Giorgio Cavallon, which we will discuss a little bit later. You can almost see the transition there, right? You can see the sort of pastel, sensuous, almost playful color work. And then you can see here a lot of the similarities. And the fact that he's also using a lot of greens and a lot of pastels, which, I mean, the green colors had become a little bit verboten in the 50s. So there you go. How to begin painting. Later in his career, it was unclear when Debencorn wrote down a list of what he considered to be the accumulated lessons of his experience as a painter thus far. The list included 10 original aphorisms he called Notes to Myself on Beginning a Painting. The full list is available elsewhere online since he shared it often, so no need to include it here, but a glimpse at a few items on the list reveals much more about his art style and about the mature attitude Debencorn developed towards abstraction, figuration, and experimentation. Let's just go to reject all cookies. Who cares? 10 rules of painting. Maybe I'll cover it later on here, but you could just very quickly attempt what is not certain. Certainty may or may not come later. It may be the valuable delusion. The pretty initial position which falls short of completeness is not to be valued, except as a stimulus for further moves. And you can really see that in Debencorn's work. You can see that people would say, well, it's kind of like an unfinished landscape. But it's not necessarily about completion or like finishing a work. It's not really about that. It's about doing a series of work that you can venture into and it allows space to breathe and there isn't an intentionality of a sort of fully fleshed out vision. It is it is Taoistic in a way. The great image has no form, right? I talk about this quite a bit about Taoist and Zen painting. But here you see that he's trying his best to leave it sufficiently open ended to where you can intuit a free play of sensual stimuli, a free play of sensations, of feelings throughout these very pale washes of color. Whereas even here with the San Francisco landscape, or here's another example, you can still intuit a lot of space throughout the picture plane, especially here. There's a lot of very denoted space. There's a lot of play of light and darks, and you can see the aerial perspective. You can see the pastels fading into the distance of very like blues, and here you have stronger colors and stronger shadows. It's traditional landscape painting, but it's not obsessed with its own image. The houses are painted very sparsely, just a few definitions and marks to denote that there's a building there. And there's a sort of sense of freedom. There's sort of like an airy lightness to it. He's not taking these images so seriously. And in that sense, there is a power in that. And it's something that let's see how far yeah. Let me read then I'll get to a quote that I'm reminded of by the filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky. So, how to begin a painting. First on the list, attempt what is not certain. Certainty may or may not come later. It may be a valuable delusion. Another item simply states tolerate chaos. These notes reveal an artist committed to searching. They show that he saw the objectivity of the so called real world as only a starting point in the inward creative process. Whether painting a portrait, a figure, or a geometric abstract composition, he was working in a direction away from certainty towards universal senses of harmony. Another item on the list states makes mistakes can't be erased, but they move you from your present position. The sentiment manifests in rich layers and textures of oil of all for his paint. I thought it said oil there. All of his paintings, throughout which he often difficult, time-consuming effort asserts their presence. Remember, unlike digital painting, no matter how long, no matter how much you try to cover up something, that mark has already been made in the sort of universe of that particular work of art. The impression has been made. Even if you cover over it, it is still there. And still informs the sense of time in the work. I had this video on it years ago. I believe it's called Time in the Work of Art or Time in the Work of Painting or something like that. It was my friend Adam Lair was interviewing another artist that had this concept about time and how the canvas records time in the process of creation. Even when you cover over whole sections that are no longer visible, they're still there. I mean, we're still, for example, in a lot of Renaissance works of art, we're still discovering the underpaintings, the grisaille, the drawings, the preparatory sketches underneath. And in some cases, they're radically different departures from what we see in the visible, fully fleshed out works of art that were created by the old masters. It's all still there. You cannot go back. There's no delete button, in other words. So this is another one. This is one of my favorite ones from the Ocean Park series. Here's where he's using a lot of gray washes, and I believe he's blending in with pencil or charcoal. And you can sort of see like an industrial space or an industrial park from an aerial point of view, but there's all these different reliefs of light and dark. There's very few dark patches, and you can see like a lot of texture. I quite enjoy this work of art. Oil, crayon, and ink on canvas. And having grown up around a lot of industrial areas myself, you can immediately see a lot of the color choices that he's using. How they're almost washed out in the sun. And if you were to put something there that would denote like a smokestack or a building or a refuse pipe or something, it wouldn't have the same effect, would it? But nevertheless, even though it is a form of geographic abstraction, your eye, there's still the traditional compositional rules of painting. Your eye is still being led around the picture plane by lights and darks. So you have to realize that when people talk about abstraction, they're not just talking about, my kid can do that. We can splash color over a surface. There's a lot of rules there. There's a lot of things that make a convincing, harmonious painting that are universal. And a lot of the foundation within abstract painting is the same as landscape. It is light and dark, color and hue and temperature of color that gets, down the road, right? But it's still there. There's still light and darks, there's still warms and cools. There still is a demarcation of space, of objects and shapes within a picture plane, within a space. You are still creating a universe. Like here, you can almost see a concrete step going into a roadway, being covered up by a lot of like the matte grays of industrial parks and so on and so forth, or even the desert. And so you see a lot of rules of composition, a lot of lines, a lot of light and form. And so the work of art, and the reason certain painters are celebrated, even when there is no immediate allusion to representation of any kind, whether it be a figure, whether it be a landscape, whether it be a architecture, there still is a sense there that what is yet to come will be fully fleshed out. And that is my challenge to people listening to this, if you've gone this far, is that there really can be an excitement with an abstract painting. There can really be a mood and a sentiment. And it's not just visual distortion. It's not just taking objects within the world and imploding them. I mean, yes, there's a lot of that. Franz Klein, for example, did that. He took a projector, he blew up a lot of furniture and different objects to the point where they just become colors and shapes. They just become lines. But it's not in the sense of a degradation necessarily of the visual. It is in a lot of ways it is a liberation of the picture plane, of the visual in the work of art. It is a liberation of the object to where it is trying to get what, okay, so you see a landscape painting, for example. There's a lot of principles there. There's that create a mood, a sentiment of lights and darks, warms and cools, composition of objects, harmony of objects, arranged in lights and darks, and so on and so forth. But what Richard Debenkorn discovered, and what many other abstract expressionists that were doing landscapes, even Jackson Pollock did a lot of figurative work in landscapes in the beginning. Vasily Kandinsky, Kandinsky did a whole hell of a lot of landscape paintings before he discovered the rules that he laid out in point and line to plane and the spiritual in art, which I have a copy of. I maybe we'll do an episode of Content Minded on someday. Maybe with a guest who's also learned, like my friend Mr. D. So the point being is that there are things in there that create a sentiment. But what Richard Debenkorn and other painters I'm going to talk about, what they're trying to do is also get behind and lay bare those things that make a visually sensuous and appealing composition. And so that is the purpose of a lot of abstraction. It is to not focus so much on the representation of an object that creates a landscape painting, for example, but it is those things behind the object that deliver to you, the viewer, that object within the world. And we can see that very apparently in Lauren Harris, which I'll get to later on. A humble giant. Richard Dibbencorn attended many high points over the course of his career. He was a founding member of the Bay Area Figurative School in the 1950s, which is credited with reintroducing figurative painting to modern American art after abstract expressionism. By the mid 1980s, he had become one of the highest paid living artists in the United States, and in the 90s, he even received the National Medal of Arts by a slick Willie, Bill Clinton, one of the highest honors the U.S. government bestows upon an artist. But despite his impact, or perhaps an attempt to defend himself from it, he remained a humble and hard-working artist. He eventually left the city, moving back to north to the Russian River Valley west of Napa. There, he continued painting until sickness debilitated him. As long as he could work, whether painting abstractions, as in the late Cigar Box Lid series, or painting landscapes of his wilderness home, he remained true to his lifelong passions: an investigation of color, shapes, and harmony, and a dedication to the ancient challenges and traditions of painting. But it's still a recognition of those ancient challenges of painting that he's struggling with. He is not trying to destroy that tradition. He is merely trying to investigate phenomenologically what the tradition of landscape painting offers to the immediate senses, to the inner eye of the audience and of the artist. To quote Morris Graves, who was well, not really close, but close in the Northwest School in Seattle. And so here you can see a lot of his brushstrokes. You have a landscape that is not a traditional blending of different elements of the sky to the ground. Rather, you have a lot of these bands of color that are ruptured by these, which you probably could see in some sense a lot of light pole, like a lot of light wires going back and forth from a field. And I know when I do plein air painting, it can be quite a challenge to get them right and to not make them as gaudy and as not to impose themselves on the landscape. It can be quite tricky. Hence why a lot of plein air painters will actually omit a lot of light poles and a lot of those wires because it sort of creates a fissure within the composition. You have to be very careful. But here, it's almost like collage. There's a lot of dots and stucco board in the background and so on and so forth. So oil and graphite on wooden cigar box lids. So what I wanted to say about this thing, this obsession with ideological artwork and pure painting, is that I mentioned there was a sense of hardness, a sense of invigoration, that you are commenting on the moment, that you are relevant within the space of time, that you are trying to forcefully push a message into the world, which no doubt has a place in the work of art. I'm not denying that. It is kind of true that most works of art, if not all works of art, have at least some form of a political activity, even by omission. But it's giving yourself the space to just work within the tradition of the work of art and to investigate the roots of what you are doing, especially with painting, in that case, with landscape painting. It reminds me of one of my favorite lines from the Tarkovsky film Stalker. And in a way, I think also, recently, within recent years, there's all this debate between you have on one side on online, you have the trads, the Christians, the ortho bros and the Catholics, and then you have on the other side the pagans and the Nietzscheans, whatever that means, right? The Nietzschean vitalists. And I think both sides do make a lot of good points. I mean, obviously, I lean towards the Christian side, and there's a lot of critiques of the whole quote unquote trad thing as it is, or rather as it manifests in the online world. And a lot of it is, well, not to get too deep into the weeds, a lot of it can be a put on. So But Tarkovsky having a very like interesting and weird and intuitive relationship to Christianity. He had this one line in Stalker that was by the stalker himself, the not the main character that's bringing the professor and the journalist, and I forget the third guy. What was he, engineer or something? Bringing them into the zone, into the room, and that's his job. And he it's almost a Christ-like pursuit because he's denying himself his eternal wish that could be granted by the room in the exclusion zone. There's this one line where he says, and there is the famous scene of the river that is given aerial perspective. And he says, you know, something that is hard and strong and imposing can be very brittle and can be very rigid and lacks mobility. But something that is supple and meek and soft is pliable and can navigate throughout the world. I know I'm butchering the statement, but that in itself is a very Taoistic like expression. It is using a soft suppleness to conform or to rather maneuver without breaking, where something that is very hard and domineering and imposing, but in a deeper, is very brittle, but in a deeper spiritual sense. That I think is probably one of the best retorts you can come up with to the sort of like, um, you know, vitalistic worship of strength and imposition and power and so on and so forth. Which, I mean, don't get me wrong, they themselves have a validity to their point, right? I mean, there's a lot of sense in which the meekness of Christianity has led to a lot of very complicated situations for a civilization, to say the least, right? But beyond that, when it comes to the work of art, even though you have people like, particularly in the political left, who have this notion of activist art, and some people on the right as well. They both have the sense of the imposition, that the demand to be heard can only be legitimized through the contemporary actions of the artist as a political actor. That the only way of legitimacy for the work of art is to have this greater social use to be operationalized. And I think both people on the left and right, they make this fundamental mistake because it is trying to wield the work of art as a weapon, which no doubt the work of art has an ability to become a psychic weapon in a way. But what Debencorn teaches us is that a sort of softness, a sort of sensuousness, a yielding action of going back to the things themselves within the work of art, of going back to those principles and that tradition and trying to investigate and fiddle around with it and create things that are not these stark, rigid ideological impositions within the world that are trying to wake you up to some truth nuke that the work of art's going to do. It's going to be operationalized to where if I create this amazing work of propaganda, then finally you'll see the real consequences of the contemporary moment and what's happening. Like that one, the guy in the CBC video, he's like, fascism's uh, spreading throughout the world, and why can't you do anything about it? And here's these landscape painters in Canada. Oh my God, the horror of that! Why are they ignoring my pressing political concerns? It's like, it's not about that. It's not about that. It's, again, that's the imposition. That is a will, a very domineering type of will that is being placed on something that existed before us, and despite evidence, despite what some people think to the contrary, painting will exist long after us. Okay, painting existed way before us, and I guarantee you, painting in some form or another will exist long after us. I'm sorry, like, as much as I'm not like necessarily 100% anti AI, I do critique a lot of the slop, but I'm not necessarily an emphatic proponent to where these people make these ridiculous statements where what's going to be the use of the special class of artist and people known as artists. I don't know. I think painting is going to still exist. I have a sneaking suspicion. And I think that, to the human soul, I understand those arguments that if there is prescient political situations, that an artist should respond to it. What I do not agree with is that A, we're viewing things totally differently, and the response to the current moment of the now, politically and culturally, will manifest very differently ideologically. Because the work of art in general, I know this is a controversial statement, the work of art kind of is like a fascistic act. It's sort of like you are purifying your lens of the world and you are imposing your vision on the world. And the thing that only you can create is given existence and breath. And so, in a way, it's like the work of art inherently has that spirit of a domineering vision that surpasses all else. But that being said, the work of art that can subtly give way and can give space to what has come before it and can maneuver and navigate, even if you think, well, it kind of looks pleasant and it's not telling me a greater social narrative, but yet it is. Because an artist and landscape painter like Richard Debencorn is responding to that which he sees around him. And he is operating within the world and he is putting into a form, a tangible form, that which the sentiments which has marked his life in the locations that he's been. And so that is a good example of that quote from Andrei Tarkovsky in Stalker. So let's move on to Lauren Harris and how Debencorn relates to Lauren Harris, Takeo Tanabe, and let's read this critique of Giorgio Cavallon from Robert Hughes. But before I get to that, let me finish up a little bit with this discussion of Richard Diebenkorn, who is truly one of the great American contemporary artists. Well, he's since passed away, but going into the 70s, 80s, and 90s, I was watching a few videos on his work, and there was one that mentions a gallery show that mentions how he was inspired by taking his first plane ride from where he was in California to, I think, Los Angeles or somewhere, or Santa Fe, where he was in Santa Fe. But he was looking at the people don't know this, but California still has a lot of rich farmland. People think California is just the major cities on the coast. Are they on the coast? I'm not terribly good with geography, but California still has a huge amount of sort of like interior farming land, and he was looking at the various farmers' fields from the sky because it was like one of these low flying connector flights, and that really inspired him because he was being taught by a lot of art teachers that would then later inspire or rather did teach the abstract expressionists in New York and elsewhere. And he was looking at these aerial photographs, and then he started to do a lot of these compositions. Some of them are related to those farmers' fields, and some of them are imagined. And it clicked for him, the sense of space and the sense of composition. But I think what's very interesting, given this theme that he was sort of like a lot of people in North America, both in Canada and in the United States, in the plein air painting tradition, he was inspired by the way light moves across vast bodies of land. And at the time, he was resisting the impulse I mean, yes, a lot of his earlier work is very heavily inspired by the orthodoxy of abstract expressionism and geometric minimalism and so on and so forth. But he always had that desire to escape back into the landscape. And he realized that you can sort of go against the grain by having this tug of war between representation and abstraction to the point where these categories are sort of meaningless because given a sort of aerial view that goes far out into the sky, these distinctions sort of become irrelevant. Whereas at the time, and by the time you get to the 60s and 70s, when pop art took over, there was this big thing with hard edge and geometric minimalism, and a lot of painters had a sort of what you would call in academic terms a sort of like post-humanist impulse and just ventured into abstraction and did works in such a way where the sort of like human element is almost vanished. Like now it's kind of like passe to think about because we have like computer programs and AI art. And before that, we had digital design programs that could generate images based on like, what's it called? Like polygons or polyphonics or whatever. And you can have like auto generated programs and sequences based off of um, different binary codes that can generate images or can translate code into a visual medium. But before all of that, there were a lot of abstract artists in the contemporary art world at the time that were trying to sort of lessen the role of the human because those humanistic values, I mean, and there's a lot of like, I think, intellectual debate. There's certainly a lot of like remnants of particular forms of humanism that I critique. But when it comes to addressing those things in the space of the work of art, it becomes complicated. It becomes very alienating. Like, for example, you have Carl Andre, who's like this weirdo communist type who wants like as minimal human intervention as possible to where a lot of his works are like found objects or are placed in by processes associated with quote unquote proletarian labor. And he had like the get up, kind of like he had like the Kropotkin coat, and he had he had this like thing where the artist can become part of that process, almost in a way delivering the work of art back into, which I mean a lot of like contemporary realists, for example, my frenemy Paul Talk, he wrote this article talking about this with contemporary realism, where he like wants the artist to become another worker, another artisan, the way that the artists were back in the day. For example, a lot of the sculptors that did a lot of ornamentation on the great cathedrals in Europe, it's like you're not going to know their names. I mean, some of them, yes, you will know a lot of there were a certain core, for example, that the Vatican employed of masons that had incredible skill and depth of space and could engineer a lot of the different, very complicated cathedral work. So Carl Andre had these like pretensions. He was a terrible person, by the way. Like he redacted one of the greatest land artists ever, Anna Mendieta, his girlfriend or wife or whatever. But Carl Andre had this thing, and there was a lot of painters that did this as well. And in that program I mentioned before with one of my favorite Canadian artists, Takeo Tanabe, he said that was the trend when he was in New York in the 60s. They were doing hard edge, they were doing geographic minimalism, they were doing things that with colors that were so flat that the hand of the artist was gone. It was vanished. And through that, art becomes autonomous. So then, you get like not necessarily, I would say, what Theodore Adorno was talking about with autonomous art in his book Aesthetic Theory, but you had, in terms of a physical medium, the beginning, the birth of the interrogation of the actual physical stuff of what the work of art is made up of in contemporary art. So that's like one of the big trends. And therefore, the hand of the artist, anything that deals with representation, quickly becomes a foil for what they believed was the sort of passe or truncated values of humanism. And even though a lot of them were like commie socialist, we are the world types, in terms of their work of art, they produced a lot of this, like, and some of it's quite interesting. I'm not bashing it right away, but it produces works of art that have this sentiment, right? Of like, there is like beyond the human. And I wonder what a lot of those artists were to make of like the contemporary moment with AI art and stuff like that. Like art that has minimal human engagement as much as possible in terms of its creation. So Richard Diebenkorn, he sort of went against that trend because he was drawn to the landscape the way that in Canada Takeo Tanabe was. And it's funny how they both come about at the same time. They both have this thing where they wanted to be hip and cool, and they wanted to take their art education further, but then something within them, like a spiritual animistic impulse almost, draws them to the landscape. And when Richard Diebenkorn saw a lot of those aerial photographs, then to him it became very clear. And there was no real tension between the two. There was something I was reading recently where it talked about this, about the artist going back into a form of labor, and a lot of I think it was the Paul Talk essay, and how like a lot of these contemporary realists, uh, they want to sort of purify the work of art into where now the artist becomes a worker again, or is in service of a lot of like ideological projects and so on and so forth. And let me show you quickly an example of what I mean from Richard Diebenkorn, if it allows me to. Yeah, here we go. Here we go. So here are some of his aerial photographs. That's one of them. Then you have, there was one in particular that uh this video essay was using. Here's one of them. Open a new tab. Oh, I can't. It's not really showing me, but you get the point. You get the point. So here is, I believe there are a few of them that are quite famous, like this one. He did a whole series of these. That leads us to this discussion of Giorgio Cavallon. Thank you for listening to the Content Minded podcast. If you wish to support me and listen to every episode in full, then please go to patreon.com/giantartproductions and substack.com/Geo's Content Corner. There you will find the full archive of every content-minded episode, as well as every Giant Art Review episode, and exclusive to all patrons, the weekly Cole Report, where I break down interesting stories and discourse from throughout the week. Subscribe today to keep the content renaissance alive.